Hey guys, so today I just want to talk to you about whether there can be meaning in life in a godless universe. So, if atheism is true, is there actually any purpose to our lives? Can we have any meaning or purpose to our lives? In fact, the ultimate question could be asked in a different way: why not commit suicide? Why should we live? Why should we continue living? What's there to live for if everything results in death? This argument's been known and presented most famously by William Lane Craig, so I'm just going to quote really briefly from him because I think this really captures the idea of the argument. So he says here, if each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, then what ultimate meaning can be given to his life? Does it really matter whether he existed at all? It might be said that his life was important because it influenced others or affected the course of history, but this shows only a relative significance to his life, not an ultimate significance. So, I personally am very persuaded by this, but it's not necessarily as an argument for theism, as William Lane Craig makes clear. For example, he says the apologetic for Christianity based on the human predicament does not even attempt to show that Christianity is true. It simply explores the disastrous consequences for humans' existence, society, and culture if Christianity should be false. Now, I don't think this should be taken as immediately absurd. Nietzsche was one of the atheists who readily recognized the absurdity of life. He embraced this absurdity. His famous quote about God is dead, is a quote explaining just how disastrous those consequences are for mankind. And so I don't think we should readily dismiss this as just simply a theistic or Christian argument to try to convince people. There seems to be a load of plausibility here. Now, Richard Taylor, one of these atheists, would respond differently. He would say, well, yes, there might not be any ultimate significance, but there's still meaning. So take the famous Greek tragedy. It's about a story of a guy named Sisyphus who was punished by the Greek gods for betraying their trust. So his punishment involved rolling up a stone up a hill for eternity. So for most people, this seems to be a prime example of meaninglessness. You're just lifting stones over and over up the hill with no ultimate purpose. Now, for Taylor, he would respond differently and say, well, no, at least there's maybe not some external meaning, but there's some internal meaning. So if the gods placed an intense desire to want to lift up that stone up the hill, he would have, that person, Sisyphus, would have satisfaction and fulfillment in doing so. So it doesn't seem as if he has no meaning. In fact, his meaning is simply to continue doing what he wants to do. So if you were to ask, what's the meaning in your life? Well, what do you most want to do? And that would be your meaning. So you get to construct your meaning. This is a kind of subjectivist account of meaning. Now, of course, one of the problems with this, as Eric Rielenberg points out, who is also an atheist, he says that, well, what happens if you have someone who enjoys eating poop? He's a happy poop eater, compared to someone who says, is finding a cure for cancer, is trying to fight for world peace, climate change, or whatever good that you want to put into that list. He's fighting for that person. So compare that to someone who's has his meaning and purpose in just eating poop all day. Now, we seem to think that there's a difference between these two, that one is objectively better than the other. It's not just about subjective taste. It's not just like, oh, well, this person's purpose in life or meaning in life is to eat poop, whereas another person's meaning in life is to help other people. And they're both equally valid. There's nothing better about one or the other. I think the general intuition is that, no, there is one that's better than the other. So I think that kind of puts a dent to Richard Taylor's radical subjectivist account. So in response to that, then we might have someone like Peter Singer come in and say, okay, well, what makes life worth living is a goal that's objectively worthwhile, something that's objectively worth pursuing. So for Singer, that would be reducing pain and increasing pleasure. So whatever we use to increase that, whatever means we use to increase that would be good. So for a Singer, what makes an action good are the consequences, not the intentions, but the consequences. Does it produce good results? That's what determines whether an act is good. And this is known as utilitarianism. The goodness of an act is solely determined by the consequences. Now, the problem with this, as Wielenberg also points out, is that, well, one way to alleviate suffering is to simply annihilate all life. And there you have it. No more suffering. That's a great solution. But of course, we know that that simply seems to be ridiculous. You know, we could also say to someone like, say, who is experiencing suicide, well, what would you say to him? You know, say that person's suffering incredibly. Would you say, yeah, go ahead, good job, commit suicide? That's the best thing to do for you because you'll alleviate your suffering. That's one possible route, you know, and it seems perfectly permissible in utilitarianism. But that doesn't seem to be something an atheist would want to adopt because it means that, you know, you can't really have a fulfilled life, at least objectively speaking. And even if you could, you know, you have to ask yourself, well, why should you care about the pain of other people? You know, that's the problem with utilitarianism, I think, is that your only concern immediately is your own pain because that's what you experience, that's what you're aware of, that's what you feel. You never feel anyone else's pain. So why should you care about anyone else's other pain unless it affects you somehow, of course. But if it doesn't affect you, like, you know, why do the wicked prosper but good men suffer, that classic problem, which we do see and it's a reality, you know, then it's perfectly good for a wicked person to continue to serve their selfish needs as long as they don't have any negative repercussions or negative consequences to themselves. And that simply seems to be completely implausible. Now, I think the most plausible response an atheist could have, in fact, I think is really interesting, is Eric Williamberg provides it, and he borrows from Aristotle. And being an Aristotelian myself, I find it somewhat persuasive because he says, well, no, you know, it's not radical subjectivism like Taylor. You know, there is, in fact, some goods. There is some good out there. There's some real purpose and meaning. But it's not in a sense that Singer's talking about. There are just like consequences. That's not the consequences that ultimately matter. So he's going to borrow from Aristotle, who says there are certain things that are just good in themselves. You know, like love, friendship, contemplation, philosophical contemplation. You know, those are things that are good in themselves, regardless of what the consequences may be, regardless of what benefits you may get from it. In fact, you may do all these things and then still die. You know, but they're still good in themselves, regardless of what the consequences are. So I think Rillenberg actually has a rather plausible response to this. But the problem, I think, though, is not so much that response, but it's his metaphysical worldview in particular. Because under a naturalistic metaphysic, way of understanding the fundamental basis of reality, their idea is simply that all particles and, you know, these quantum particles, what have you, they're all meaningless. They all have no value. So how can you derive value from something that otherwise has no meaning, has no good in itself? These things aren't goods in themselves. So how can you produce this? You know, it's kind of like trying to produce a blue Lego house out of white Legos. You can't. If all you had are white Legos, you can't produce a blue Lego house. Not without something external perhaps to edit that. If you had some kind of holographic, you know, glasses or something to kind of change colors, but the thing in themselves, at least, they can't be changed to be something else. So in the same way, atheism is inherently a meaningless, valueless metaphysical system. Where does it derive its value? It can't. There's no such a thing as something that's good in itself. The second problem, too, is that if you're going to borrow from Aristotle, you're going to have to embrace this idea of teleology or final causality. And that, his view, means that there are certain purposes built into the very nature of things. And most philosophers, at least modern philosophers these days, tend to reject that view because they're naturalists and they want to say, yeah, we don't need purposes, we don't need functions. Because if they did embrace that, they would lead to all sorts of different difficulties for the mechanistic view or the naturalistic conception of reality. It would rather naturally lead to God's existence, in fact, as Aquinas' fifth way would show. So there's some difficulties there. So I think Williamberg has the most promising response, but it doesn't go far enough because the ultimate problem is simply the worldview in which you don't have any inherent built-in purpose. You don't have any value that's laden into the nature of things. You have to embrace a whole host of Aristotelian thought about essentialism, about there being such a thing as essences, things that have essences in themselves that make it what it is, and what it is determines what it ought to be. And so this is all kind of metaphysical jargon that I'm borrowing right now here, but it shows that there's a significant problem here that the atheists have to address. And so the typical atheist would then probably just resort to saying, because they're skeptics, they don't really want to make any positive claims about what reality is. It's easier to simply say no. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence? And to actually kind of posit an explanation. So they'll typically say, well, yeah, there's still meaning though internally. There's still some kind of meaning and you can have that. But so what? So what if you can have meaning internally? That's like a dog finding satisfaction chasing its tail all day, or some person eating poop, being happy and finding meaning in that, or some Christian finding meaning in his own religion even though it's false. For the atheists that's ridiculous because they think that's a delusion and they should be seeking truth. But in reality, if their view of subjective meaning is true, then anyone can construct their own meaning. Even a Christian and even a murderer or a rapist can construct their own value system and meaning. And that's what's meaningful for them. So ultimately, that doesn't mean anything because, you may have some relative or subjective internal meaning, but ultimately the objective fact of the matter is that you will die just like anyone else. All the people that have lived before you, if you look at your grandpa, your great grandpa, look at all the lives that they lived, the life that they lived, and yet they died and they're now going to become forgotten. And you too will become forgotten. And I think this is a really compelling existential kind of challenge. It isn't necessarily a positive argument again, but I think this is a compelling existential challenge when we evaluate ourselves and look at ourselves and our place in this universe. We wonder why. Why are we here? What's the point of life? It's just an endless cycle of working, of going to sleep, going to bed, cleaning, doing all these different responsibilities. Is there any point to this? The question is, if you're an atheist, why not just kill yourself? I know it sounds like a morbid way to put it, but if you do have suicidal thoughts and you are in pain, especially, there is no reason to live. Just alleviate your suffering, just snap it out, die. No point. You're just one blink, one piece of dust, arrangement of particles. There's nothing to your life, objectively. And all the people who think you care about you are going to die too. They're just as worthless as you. So the thoughts of other people, you might comfort yourself by, oh, this person cares about me. He actually cares. Well, that's like a worm caring about what another worm thinks. Well, it's meaningless. Let me be absolutely clear. I am not suggesting by any means that anyone should kill themselves. I am of the belief that everyone has intrinsic value because they're made in God's image. And God loves each and every person, that he has sent his son to die for us, that he has this awesome and beautiful love for us, that he has counted every tear that you have had, even though you may not feel like he has or that he cares. I believe that every soul is worth fighting for, because every soul is worth more than the entire universe and all the universes put together. So I want to reach out to you. If you are in that state, you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, I know what that feels like, but there is hope. There is a message of salvation. If you don't believe it, then at least give it a chance. You have nothing to lose at this point. What do you have to lose except your life? And that's worth so much. But if you disagree with me, just let me know and we can have a great discussion, I'm hoping. I know I did this a little provocatively, but I do have good intentions here. And I hope you all are the best. Thank you.